Hello, my name is Norena Shopland, and I'm a writer and historian with a specialism in the history of sexual orientation and gender identity, particularly in reference to Wales. And I'm here today on behalf of Pride Cymru's LGBT plus History Month celebrations to talk to Chris Bryant, who's been MP for the Rhondda since 2001, about his new book, The Glamour Boys, the secret story of the rebels who fought for Britain to defeat Hitler. Croeso, Chris. Diolch, thank you for being here.
Thanks very much for having me.
Of course, you're no stranger to history yourself. Among your many achievements, your civil partnership was the first to be held in the Houses of Parliament. Can you tell us very briefly how that came about?
Well, we had to change the law, not just to allow civil partnerships, obviously, but also to allow the Palace of Westminster to hold civil partnerships, because it was, as an MP, you were allowed to get married, as a straight MP, you were allowed to get married in the Crypt Chapel, but the Crypt Chapel isn't available because it's an Anglican chapel. It's not available to gay couples. So we had to get the Palace of Westminster licensed. And the nice thing is that because we went down that route, it meant that me and my husband Jared were the first to get civilly partnered there, but any member of the public can get a civil partnership in the Palace of Westminster now.
Great, brilliant. Well, you've written this absolutely fascinating book, The Glamour Boys, about a number of men whom we would today identify as gay or queer. Queer is the word you use because that was the most prominent term at the time, who in the 1920s visited Germany regularly due to the sexual liberation there. And so they were in a perfect situation to view the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And several of the men were MPs, but when they and others tried to warn the British government of the real possibility of war across Europe, they were ridiculed and ignored. And I have to confess, it's not a period I'm particularly familiar with, so I did learn a lot. So is this your first book on queer history? And what do you think it adds to that history?
So just about the word queer, I mean, the reason I used it was some of these men got married. I'm not sure whether that makes them bisexual. Certainly the word bisexual wasn't a word that was around at the time at all. I mean, maybe they were predominantly homosexual. I think that's certainly true of Harold Nicholson, for instance, though he was married to Vita Sackville-West, and she was also, incidentally, predominantly homosexual, and they both had a series of affairs, and they both knew about them all. So I couldn't use the word bisexual. I couldn't use the word homosexual. They wouldn't really have used. It was around, but predominantly really as a kind of medical term rather than anything else. They might have used words like pervert or Uranist or earning, none of which means, conveys anything for us today, I think. And that's why I landed on the word queer. It's not an attempt to sort of go down the direction of discussing queer studies, as it were. It's just, it was a word that was around at the time, albeit used pejoratively, and I wanted to reclaim it for them. And I'm not sure that they individually would have been all that happy with me using that word, incidentally.
And how much do you think the story adds to LGBT plus history?
Oh, phenomenally. But one of the people I write about is Bob Boothby, who met Hitler in 1932 and was one of the first to warn, long before Churchill was warning about Hitler. And it's worth bearing in mind, of course, that Churchill, though we all think that he single-handedly brought Britain to the war with Germany and defeated fascism, actually Churchill was quite a supporter of Franco in Spain and of Mussolini in Italy. So it has a bit more of a mixed track record, whereas Bob Boothby, right in 1932, is saying, I'm sorry, we have to be very worried about the rise of fascism in Germany. And now Bob Boothby said that whilst homosexuals might be good at occasional flashes of wild bravery, that what they were no good at was sustained fortitude. And I think that played into quite a strong stereotype of gay men, that they were flighty, that they could never be courageous, that they'd never be able to catch a ball or fire a gun or whatever. What this story, I think, shows is that these men showed sustained fortitude, both in the way they engaged in politics and for quite a few of them during the war themselves in the armed forces.
Because there was a lot of that. I mean, early on in the book, you mentioned an array of names. How important was it for you to show quite how extensive these queer networks were at the time?
Well, I think what is striking to me is that if you ask most people, why did we go to war in 1939 with Germany? People might say, well, it's because of the Holocaust. And we in Britain were shocked by what Germany was doing to the Jews. Actually, reading through this history a bit more carefully, there's no evidence of that at all. One of the very few people who was saying that there was a Holocaust going on in Germany and that Britain needed to fight the war because of that was Victor Cazalet, one of the people I write about in the book, who I'm very convinced was gay. So that's, and the other reason that people might advance is that part of the Holocaust was the way that Nazis treated gay men, arresting them, putting them in concentration camps and so on. But actually, in the United Kingdom, we were arresting homosexual men on the flimsiest of evidence, on the slightest of pretexts, and sending them to prison with lashing and hard labour for 2 to 5 years. And anti-Semitism in the UK was quite pronounced. So one of the things I've tried to show is that Britain wasn't actually a saint at this time at all. But also, I think if you were to ask most historians, who were the heroes in the hour that made sure that Britain didn't appease Hitler in the end, but did oppose him, they'd cite Anthony Eden and Winston Churchill. But actually, if you look at all the men who were around them in Parliament, who were organising the group that met every week, a lot of them were gay men. Ronnie Cartland, the younger brother of Barbara Cartland. Who knew that Barbara Cartland had a younger brother? Jack McNamara, the MP for Chelmsford, who started the 1930s as a proud supporter of wanting a rapprochement with Germany, but visited Dachau in 1936 and saw gay men in prison there. And I think that that's what changed his mind. Victor Cazalet, that I've already referred to. Philip Sassoon, who was a gay Jewish minister in the government, who was a very close friend of Anthony Eden's. Harry Cruikshank, who was a conservative junior minister as well. Rob Bernays, another member on the Liberal member of the Liberal Party, but on the government side of the House. And all of these people surrounded Anthony Eden and Winston Churchill and were the kind of backbone of the group, even though they weren't necessarily the most prominent, famous members of it.
And most of the men, they did come from quite a privileged, wealthy back. I mean, obviously, Ronnie Cartland didn't. He hardly had any money, so he was helped out by his sister. But they are, for the most part, wealthy and privileged men, aren't they?
Oh, Victor Cazalet is phenomenally wealthy. He has a very, very large house in Mayfair and buys a house next door to Harold Nicholson down in Kent and has it rebuilt at great expense, beautifully decorated, and has lovely, rather wild house parties there, where it is said that Liz Taylor was conceived, indeed. Yes, a lot of them were wealthy. And there were 2 veils of secrecy that could protect you from the prying eyes of others. One was getting married. And quite a few men decided to get married, not least because one of the sort of myths about gay men was that they would be lonely in old age. And, most people are anxious about loneliness, and so they would marry. And the second thing that could protect you was living in a kind of what I would call a homosocial circle of people, all wealthy and all adhering to the same rules. But if you were poor, or if you were from a working class background, it's much more difficult. You didn't have the privacy that wealth could afford you. Indeed.
One of the things that I've come across as a writer historian when writing about LGBT plus issues is the researcher's cut when using secondary sources, namely that leaving out of certain aspects of the story that writers either don't want to include, and certainly a lot of past writing people did not want to include any references to sexual orientation or gender identity, or didn't feel confident about their knowledge of the history. Do you think that queer people who write queer stories bring their own experiences into the narrative and give it a different dimension that possibly non-queer people don't?
Well, two things I'd say. First of all, when I originally came across this story about Jack McNamara, who had Guy Burgess as his researcher and went on sex tours of Germany and France, I was sort of intrigued and wanted to chase down elements of that story, and maybe other people wouldn't want to. But I thought I wouldn't come across enough hard facts, documentary evidence, because documentary evidence is the kind of thing that could be used in court to send you to prison back in the 1930s. So I toyed with writing it as fiction, but I steadily came across more and more factual information, people's diaries, like the artist Arthur Let Haynes, who was a close friend of Jack McNamara's. His diaries are in the Tate Gallery, and they were a great source. But it was only because I pulled at that little strand of history that I landed up going to the Tate Gallery for news about a politician. Making those connections is a difficult bit sometimes. And the second thing is, you're absolutely right. Sometimes previous historians, including sometimes I think gay historians, have deliberately left out parts of the story. So there are 3 letters in Eton College Library written from Gottfried von Cramm to Victor Cazalet. Gottfried von Cramm, if you're a tennis fan, is a hero. He was very handsome German tennis star who lost the Wimbledon finals in 1935 to Fred Perry and in 1936 to Don Budge. Was expected to win in 1937 because the other two had gone professional, so couldn't play at Wimbledon. Gottfried although married, happened to have a male Jewish lover and was arrested in Germany in 1937 and sent to prison for the best part of 9 months. And he wrote to Gottfried von Cramm, he wrote to Victor Cazalet, because Victor was also a great tennis player who'd played in the Wimbledon singles in 1933. He didn't get through to the finals. They'd met, they'd become friends. These letters have been there for several years. They've been used by previous biographers, but nobody referred to the story of Gottfried being arrested in Germany for his sexuality in any of these previous accounts in relation to Victor Cazalet, nor did they mention that Victor Cazalet helped get Gottfried's lover, gay Jewish lover, out of Germany to Portugal and then to Palestine. So I think sometimes people expurgated history, and it actually made some of these figures lesser figures, I think, rather than bigger figures.
One of the men, Rob Bernays, said he understood the attraction of Nazism. And certainly there seems to be an attraction in modern times for the far right. How much parallel do you think there is in these queer men warning about Hitler and the LGBT plus community and other diversities warning about Trump and other far right leaders?
Well, I think that we should never take our freedoms for granted. And actually, this period of freedom that we have today is very recent, very new. The most liberal place in the world for gay men in the 20th century was Berlin in 1930. And yet by 1936, Himmler, Hitler and Goering were carting people off to concentration camps, torturing them, demanding that they hand over names of their friends, and many of them were killed. Interestingly, I still don't think we've got an adequate memorial of those people who were killed in the Nazi concentration camps. We don't even have a list of all their names. So part of the reason for writing the book was wanting to say to people, don't take all of what we have today for granted. But also, I think it was striking to me the level of anti-Semitism in Britain in the 1930s. Some of it openly sanctioned by the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain through the Black Ops unit that he set up under Sir Joseph Ball, and the magazine that he secretly bought to pump out his propaganda, called, ironically enough, Truth. And that mirrors, I think, some of the anti-Semitism in Britain today, as much on the left, incidentally, as on the right. And it just struck me how the gay, quite often authoritarian regimes go for the Jews first and then the gays.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as I said, it's not a period I'm overly familiar with, and I really didn't know how awful Neville Chamberlain was. He and his henchman, Sir Joseph Ball, run some really vile, dirty trick campaigns. And we are accustomed in modern times of false news. But this was false news on a grand scale. How would you compare what Chamberlain and Ball did to somebody like Trump?
Well, it's a very different era, isn't it? Because one of the striking elements of the 1930s is that this is the last time before you have opinion polls and a polling of public opinion. So most politicians at the time were running on the basis of what their family thought, or what they'd heard at a dinner party, or what they'd heard at a rally. Rallies are notoriously poor indicators of wider public opinion, as the Labour Party found in the last general election, and I'm glad to say, as Trump found in the United States of America. But Neville Chamberlain and Stanley Baldwin both believed that public opinion in the UK was firmly opposed to any further war with Germany, come what may and at whatever price. That was generally the view amongst a lot of politicians. And that's why I think the men I've written about who go against that tide were being particularly brave. They certainly believed that the public thought they were warmongers, and that they were sticking out their neck. And some of them got accused of, wanting a war because they wanted to fill the pockets of rich Jews. I mean, these are the kind of arguments that were out there at the time. And it's worth bearing in mind that Neville Chamberlain had a majority in the House of Commons of 225, a majority. So the government whips were phenomenally powerful. And anybody who put their head above the parapet, who had any kind of secrets to hide, must have been in permanent fear.
Indeed, yes. I mean, there were quite a few homosexual men in the Nazi Party. And do you think they wouldn't have been so determined to go out and destroy them if there weren't men in prominent positions in the party?
So one of the strange things of writing the book was all these British men wealthy British men who went to Germany, met quite a lot of the early gay Nazis, and Hitler knew that Ernst Röhm was gay. He can have been in no doubt about it because there's lots of reports of it. And Ernst Röhm didn't really try to hide it very much. And Ernst was appointed deliberately by Hitler as head of the SA, the stormtroopers. And then he proceeded to appoint quite a lot of other gay men to senior posts, including one of the most unpleasant men of all, most violent and boorish and thuggish, Edmund Hines, who was the chief of police in Silesia. And it's a bit odd when Rob Bernays goes to visit him, because you can sort of feel him fancying Edmund Hines in a kind of slightly disturbed way. What was intriguing is, I mean, we've all heard of the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when Hitler bumps off, large numbers of the senior cadre within the Nazi Party and in other parties as well, including Ernst Röhm and Edmund Hines. Indeed, Hitler personally arrests Edmund Hines in bed with his lover at Wannsee. But what I had never heard when I was taught at school was that this was Hitler bumping off all the gays, which is what Hitler himself said to the Reichstag. And Goering explained it was important to, clean the stables because this was polluting and tainting the Nazi Party and the Aryan race. And interestingly, the Times back here reported the execution of all these men as necessary cleaning up exercise. Quite extraordinary. Now, I think a lot of the men that I'm writing about saw this moment as a frightening one, because they could sort of, it's not that they identified with the gay Nazis, but they identified with their sexuality at least.
And at one point in Parliament, you say there were 200 bachelors, and they received a lot of criticism for being so. And certainly in later years, the Conservative promoted the family as one of their central planks. And of course, we have Section 28, which banned the so-called promotion of homosexuality and the wording of pretend families. Do you think we can trace a path from this criticism of those 200 bachelors, many of whom were gay or queer, and the promotion of the ideal family in politics?
No, I think it goes back. It's the other way around in a sense. I think that there was a kind of moral panic about homosexuality from round about 1880 through to 1967, which we only sort of partially saw off in 1967 with the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, and then it continued into Section 28. It had, and the arrest of Oscar Wilde cast a long shadow over British politics. But it's interesting, repeated attempts to increase the penalties and increase the number of different offences that you could be caught out for, including gross indecency, which could either be, which was very ill defined, and so it was entirely up to the police and the courts to decide whether it had been whether it occurred, and it could be done either in public or in private, first time ever. Importuning, you could be arrested for hanging around outside a house or outside a theatre. And lots of people sent to prison for that for 2 years with hard labour, and the number of prosecutions rose and rose and rose throughout this period, and indeed after the Second World War continued under David Maxwell Fyfe, who was the Conservative Home Secretary and then Lord Chancellor, who ironically enough had helped draft the European Convention on Human Rights, and yet said that he wanted to rid England of this plague. So I always thought I saw Section 28 as a kind of last sort of part of that whole sequence of 100-year-long sequence, really.
And that's one of the things that I wondered about in the book. I mean, this is a period where the police had enormous powers and they could arrest somebody simply on a suspicion. And you mentioned one man, Thomas, who, when he's arrested, has a powder puff in his pocket, and the police use this against him. So why?
From the Ronda.
Yes. So why in the Dirty Tricks campaign that Chamberlain and Ball ran, why didn't they out the Glamour Boys to the police and thereby cripple the opposition? Or were there just so many of them?
I think that's exactly what they were doing. I think they were holding, the point about a sword of Damocles is it's only any good whilst it's still hanging over your neck, isn't it? Once you've used it, it's no use. And so I think that's what they were doing. And it undoubtedly made people hesitate. Rob Bernays hesitated to resign, and Ronnie Cartland was permanently anxious. Kept on having newspapers ringing up and saying, "Why are you still a bachelor?" Things like that, and you just had to be extremely careful. And that was, part of the hold that Chamberlain had over these men.
Do you think they could have done more if they weren't keeping one eye out on being outed?
Well, they might have done, but the difficulty was that with a majority of 225, it's pretty difficult to see off a government, and also at this time there was a great deal of deference towards those in authority. The Labour Party was very conflicted because part of it was fairly ardently pacifist, but obviously very opposed to right-wing dictatorships in Spain, Italy, and Germany. So I think a lot of these men felt themselves to be in quite a complicated situation. Jack McNamara was probably the kind of boldest sexually of the lot, and it's quite interesting that he was he served in the British Army in India from 1927 to 1933, but then he was in a reserve regiment, the London Irish Rifles, and it's pretty clear that that was a unit that was remarkably relaxed about homosexual officers. And it's worth bearing in mind that, you know, men could spend a lot of their life at this time entirely in the company of men, because Parliament was almost well, as Churchill called it, a masculine assembly. You could be in your officers' mess and your gentlemen's club and hardly see a woman all day if you didn't want to, and nobody thought that was odd. Yeah.
I mean, the book certainly does add a lot of new information to queer history. Do you think LGBT plus people know enough about their history, and should it be included in being taught in schools?
Well, I'm hopeful that in the future, if anybody is being taught about the Night of the Long Knives, that the sexuality of those who are bumped off and the rationale for it is fully explained.
Indeed.
I hope that when we talk about the Second World War, that this is not whataboutery, but that, you know, the murder of the Jews and the murder of gay men is part of that. I hope that people will understand that our freedoms are never guaranteed. So yes, I hope that people understand all of that more. I hope people in the book will take some delight in some of the kind of joyful moments as well. You know, the parties where you had to decide whether you were going to go naked from the waist up or the waist down, and the Turkish baths in Jermyn Street called the Savoy, where you could go and rent a bachelor suite for the night and enjoy yourself and no doubt other men. And the next day you could quite happily tell everybody that you'd gone to the Savoy the night before.
So what are you working on another book now?
I am. It's called James and John. It's the history of the last two men who were hanged for buggery in 1835.
Brilliant. Look forward to it. When is that hopefully out?
I have no idea. I'm just at the... I mean, I love the bit, as you'll understand this as a historian, I love the bit of finding facts around which, you know, you can build a story.
Particularly when you find facts that other people haven't found.
Exactly so. It was like, and Maggie Hamlin was quite helpful in pointing me to the Tate Gallery archive. I had no idea that there'd be diaries there that would tell me about Jack McNamara's life with his servant Paddy Kennedy. So, and interestingly enough, since the book, I've come across more material which might lead to another book about the three Tennant sisters, who were a fascinating set of very, it's a bad word maybe, but ballsy women during this period. It's odd also, incidentally, writing as a Labour MP about Conservatives, though at least it was a joy for me that the first rebellion that Ronnie Cartland and Jack McNamara engaged in was complaining that the Conservative government wasn't putting enough money into the depressed areas, including Treforest in the Rhondda.
Well, we definitely need more books about ballsy women. And the book Glamour Boys is available through all the usual sources, but I understand that profits are going to charity.
So if you want a signed copy, if you just Google Chris Bryant signed Glamour, then we have we can send them out from my office, and all the profits from that go to local charities in the Rhondda. Yeah.
Oh, just one other thing. I wrote about Cedric Morris and Arthur Haines in Forbidden Lives. They're amazing characters.
Yeah.
Because the Glamour Boys, I mean, they were surrounded by actors and artists and writers and everybody else.
Noel Coward is the next door neighbour to Philip Sassoon, big friends with Bob Boothby, has an interesting meeting with Churchill because he wants to help in the Second World War, but Churchill basically says, well, you could play some tunes, couldn't you? And that's not what Noel Coward really thought. Ivor Novello and Noel Coward are both listening to the wireless when Neville Chamberlain comes back from Munich and does his speech about peace for our time, and Novello starts crying, and coward punches him and says, "You just don't understand." Yes, and of course that was the other veil of secrecy you could have. If you were an actor or a musician, then somehow or other that didn't count. It didn't matter so much. So Cecil Beaton, was an integral part of polite society. Indeed, photographing the Queen and others. But it was sort of okay for artists to be artistic.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would recommend anybody watching to read the book. It is a fascinating story, and I agree with you. I think there's a lot more that can be told around all these characters in the book. I think it's something that could run for some time. So yes, I definitely would recommend reading the book. It's a great read. It's a good read. It's easy to read. I like books that you can read easily and not have to plough your way through academic speech and thing. So yes, do buy the book. It's great. So that just leaves me to say, on behalf of Pride Cymru and myself, thank you very much, Chris. I've enjoyed our chat, and I wish you the best with the book.
Thanks very much for having me. We're trying to get it turned into a TV series as well.
Who do you want to play the characters?
Oh, I don't know. I don't subscribe to the idea that only gay actors can play gay characters, but not least because I don't know what that would mean. Who would be allowed to play Harold Nicholson, who is bisexual?
Indeed. Yes. Well, hopefully that will go ahead, and we look forward to it. So once again, thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.